Hola, soy Wilfredo Seda y bienvenidos a Piénsalo Bien. Hello, I'm Wilfredo Seda and welcome to Think It Over. This program explores strategies for education, prevention, and treatment of drug abuse. We hear in the news of the heroin, opioid, fentanyl overdoses in Lancaster County and really all over the country. Today we want to learn what implications this scenario has on the law enforcement agencies in their quest to control the trafficking of these drugs. With me today is Craig Stedman, who is the elected district attorney of Lancaster County. Mr. Stedman has served in the role of district attorney since 2008, supervising all criminal prosecutions in Lancaster County. Prior to his election, D.A. Stedman served as assistant district attorney in Lancaster for 17 years. During that time, he prosecuted all manner of felony, misdemeanor offenses to include violent crime and drug offenses. Mr. Stedman, I want to welcome you to Think It Over. I'd like to start out with your vast experience as a prosecutor. How has the drug scenario changed from you first started to what's the dynamic that we have today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and good morning. This is such an important issue to our communities. I've never seen anything like it. So I've been a prosecutor since 1991, and there's always the issue of drugs, but when I started compared to now, it's not close. I think we're on pace for about 200 deaths this year, which is higher than ever before.
Yeah, I think we had 50 from January to March.
It's incredible. And just to give you some perspective on that, the whole state of Pennsylvania in 1979, there were 134 people that died from it. So you're talking about, in our county, almost twice as much around there as to what the whole state was in 1979. So that gives you kind of a glimpse. Now, I was obviously still in school in 79, but when I started, there wasn't much heroin activity. There certainly wasn't any other drugs, even more powerful ones out there. If you had a heroin deal or a heroin case, it was the exception. You could probably count on one or both hands those number of cases. And the same thing with people forget with the drug cases. It's not just the drug case itself. There's the DUIs. So people under the influence of alcohol or a combination of alcohol and drugs or just drugs.
Right.
And there were almost no DUIs drug-related back when I started. And now, I think last year, so we had about 1,600 DUIs a year. 600 were drug-related. And that's only the ones that we catch. So you're talking about thousands of drug-related DUIs. And that's just one aspect of how widespread this devastation is. People don't even think about DUIs. You talk about heroin, you think about the overdoses, maybe the medical community, the risks of the cost of their resources, of course the families that are getting torn apart by these things, and then traditional crimes that a lot of your home break-ins, a lot of your Turkey Hill robberies, things like that are drug-related. People have to trying to support their habit, but then you've got the whole other aspect of the DUI. So that's one example. I can tell you about 10 years ago, probably about 10% of our drug task force cases were heroin related. And the drug task force is the countywide agency that concentrates on mid to upper level dealers.
And that's composed of who?
So they're county detectives, but most of them are actually donated from municipal departments. And then we pay their salary while they're loaned to us. And then we use them on countywide jurisdictions. So they go all over the county. So 10 years ago, probably about 10–12% of the cases were heroin. We're up over 70% of the cases are heroin now. So the other drugs are still out there. You still have marijuana, you still have cocaine, and you have some of these synthetic drugs that didn't even exist before. But the predominant amount of work that the county drug task force is doing is all focused on heroin now. So a tremendous amount of our resources are going to that. And of course, when we file those charges, we have to prosecute those cases. So my prosecutors are spending more time on it. And again, that's not to mention even the burdens on the medical community and the first responder community. They're going out and saving often, unfortunately, the same person over and over again. Right. And what I'm hearing, there's the financial cost of that, but then there's a morale, emotional, psychological cost to that too, because I'm starting to hear from the EMTs that this is the 5th time we've been out to save this guy. Like when's something going to change? What's going to be done? Because we have the immunity statute now, so we really can't arrest them.
And that statute, what does that prevent you from doing?
So basically, the statute is a well-intended statute that they want people to save lives first, and that's the priority, and we all agree with that. So they want people to call in if somebody's overdosing, and what that essentially says is if somebody calls in and the police respond or the EMTs respond, they see drugs all over the place, you can't charge anybody with it. So that makes sense in that sort of concept. The problem is we can't do anything with these people. So even if you've been there 3 times the same day to save the guy who's overdosed on heroin, you can't force them into some kind of treatment or even in prison. Sometimes, honestly, you need to put people in prison to save their lives because they're not thinking straight. The addiction, the power of this addiction is something that we can't conceive of. And
yeah, you know, on that, I have a quote from the Director of Behavioral Services in Frederick County, Maryland, and she says, if death were a deterrent to drug use, we wouldn't be in this situation. But that's not the way addiction works. The disease reprograms the brain to seek more drugs, even in the face of death.
Yes, and that I couldn't agree with that more. And the example that I use is it's so powerful. The best way to think about it is you could put a bag of heroin down in front of a table, and a heroin user say, "Look, I'll give you that, but I got to cut your left arm off." People are going to say, "You go ahead and cut my left arm off." All the focus is the next hit. It's always on the next hit. And if you're not an addict, I can't relate to that. You can't relate to that. Mm-hmm. The power of that. People know it's wrong. They don't even. It's not like people wake up and say, "I want to be a heroin addict today." Right. I mean, they're getting consumed with it. And I've seen more and more studies that talk about that there's a genetic aspect to a lot of this. That some people are more genetically predisposed to that addiction than others. And so you're fighting biology, you're fighting science, mm-hmm. and what I've learned too is it takes the brain about at least 270 days to rewire, to break, to have any chance of going forward. And it's going to be a lifetime struggle for those people. So we've got to really look at shifting a lot of our resources in the way we look at the problem. We have a lot of short-term rehabs. They're very well intended, and people are great, they're dedicated, they want to turn somebody around. But you're fighting the science, you're fighting biology, so a 15-day rehab isn't going to work. A 30-day rehab isn't going to work, and that's what a lot of your insurance companies will only pay for that kind of a rehab. So it's very, very frustrating for me. I'm a prosecutor, but ultimately, what I want is prevention. We want education. Right. I don't want to be having to prosecutions mean something else has failed somewhere along the line. That's the last resort. So really try to take my office and our mission much more broad than what traditional prosecutors. We just wait for the crime and then we prosecute. I'm trying to stop it beforehand. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come to your show and talk about this, because this is going to, in the long run, do more than what it is for me just arresting somebody.
Right. Now, the courts, are there different now ways that, you're with some of the cases that you're prosecuting, that look at alternatives to jail, prison?
Sure. So we have and have had for a long time a drug court. So you've got 2 different kinds of really drug cases, and well, there's I guess a variety, but you've got the addict person who is maybe sharing with somebody else, but really all they're focused on is the next hit and just fulfilling their addiction. And I think they need to be treated differently than the predator drug dealer. That the one, typically they're not even users. They just want to make money. Mm-hmm. And they come into parts of our community and they look at schools as, and I've heard this directly from a drug dealer said this, pointed at the school to an undercover agent and said, hey, because the guy said, hey, who am I going to sell to here? I don't see anybody to sell to. The drug dealer pointed at the school and said, right there's your customers for life. Let's get the kids, let's get them hooked, because it's all about making money. Those people, there is a role. We have to arrest and prosecute and put those people away. And what I have to do and what our office has to do is really look for that which ones are the addicts that we need to mm-hmm. steer towards treatment, and which ones are the predator drug dealers. There's really nothing to do but make them pay and incapacitate them for as long as we possibly can. Now, what's changed for us, what's been one of the things that's been more difficult for us, not only is there so much more heroin out there, and so many dealers, but the courts have struck down the mandatory sentencing for those big level dealers. So what we're seeing is they're getting about half the sentence of what they got just a few years ago, because we can't put them in they go back to the guidelines. The guidelines are about half of what the mandatories were. So I've lost the ability not only to incapacitate those big drug dealers for a couple years, but when they have the heavier sentences, they're more likely to talk about the next guy up the chain. And they could say, hey, all right, I'm looking at a 5-year sentence, but I'm going to tell you where I'm getting my supply from, which is good because even if we don't arrest somebody, as long as we can stop heroin from coming into Lancaster, you're going to save somebody's life. And that's what I tell the officers all the time. Just as long as you, even if you get some of it, even if you get 10 bags of it off the street, that's 10 bags that somebody could overdose and die from. So
Let's talk about fentanyl.
Yeah.
Okay. What is it, and how is it used, and why is it a killer?
Yeah, so fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin. It was designed as the painkiller for people that are facing the end of life that morphine isn't working anymore for, that they're just suffering. And so, and it's also, it says right on there, it's only for people that have developed an opioid tolerance. So it's for those people, the cancer patient who's struggling, they've been on morphine for so long that their body's tolerant, the morphine's not working anymore. Then you bring in fentanyl. So that's what it's for. But what we've seen now is dealers are starting to lace some of the heroin with it. So they're mixing it with some of the heroin, and they're also just selling it straight. And
because it's more potent.
It's so much more potent. And here's the thing, and this goes back to the addiction. The addicts become used to the stuff. So you become you try marijuana for the first time. This is the greatest thing that ever happened to them. But they get used to it. So then they start 4 or 5 hits of it. Now 10 hits of it's not working anymore. So then they go to cocaine, and the same thing happens. And then they go to heroin. So when they become used to the heroin, they're not getting the same thing. They're always looking for a greater hit. And you had mentioned that quote, they are willing to risk death. So even though they know fentanyl is so dangerous, it's more potent and it's going to give them a bigger high. And this is one of the unintended consequences of the Narcan. So the Narcan is what I have in all my police departments. We give it to save somebody, bring them back from death from an overdose. It will do that. But some of the users are now carrying Narcan with them, and they'll have somebody sit there with them with the Narcan. So if they die from the fentanyl, they can use the Narcan and come back. They're willing to risk death to get that big high.
Talking about that, I think in Philly they were just talking about this report I was reading, these safe sites where addicts could go and there's a medical professional there. Obviously, you know, I'm sure a lot of folks have problems with it, and I don't know if there are laws that, you know, block that. How do you view that?
I haven't read a whole lot about it. I mean, it's still illegal to use heroin. I think there's a community aspect problem that they're coming in and using it. Who wants that next to them, where the users are all coming in and do that. So there's a little bit of that. I think, you know, I'm willing to discuss anything and see what's the best solution. I think ultimately that doesn't solve the problem. Right. It just perpetuates the problem. It maybe makes it, you know, safer for that individual, but we're not breaking the addiction. To me, there's treatment programs like the Karen Foundation that they have a model of success, but it takes a tremendous amount of investment of time and resources. And also the other thing that I'm seeing is, and I'm learning because I've learned so much about this. I didn't go to become a prosecutor to learn about heroin. I mean, I'm not a scientist or a psychologist, but
or a
chemist. One of the things that we're finding out is the treatment programs have to include the family. It can't just be the individual. The family has to be part of the long-term solution. You have to have that support network. So to get to your question, I don't whether I'm informed enough about it. I don't see that as a long-term solution.
Right.
That just seems to be maybe, you know, taking care of one aspect of the problem, but maybe inserting some others. And of course, like I said, they're still using heroin. And for me, the goal would be we've got to stop that through. Part of it will be my job to get those big dealers. Part of it is stopping at the border. Most of the, if not all the heroin that's coming to Lancaster is coming across the border from Mexico.
And what about the fentanyl?
Fentanyl most of it comes from China, and they manufacture that. It's a synthetic, and there's something called carfentanyl, which we didn't even talk about, which is an elephant tranquilizer.
Okay.
And that's even 50 to 100 times more potent than fentanyl. And we haven't had that in Lancaster that I'm aware of, but it has been in Pennsylvania. And you talk about, and the other thing about this, and I'm glad you brought up fentanyl again, these substances are not only deadly to the user, but they're deadly to the first responder.
Yeah,
so the first responder could die from touching them.
Yeah, I saw something in the paper today, yesterday, I don't know, So what happens to the first responder?
So if they, again, so you think of it as 50 times more potent than 50 to 100 times. I've read different things, so I'm just going to say 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin. They can actually touch it, and again, the EMTs don't have any opioid tolerance at all. They've built up no tolerance to this drug, so it's actually more likely to kill them than it would a drug addict. So now what we do is we have them all gloved up. It's also changed the way we do these things called field tests. We used to be able to test the drugs at the scene. Is it really a drug? Now we have to be careful because you start fumigating that stuff, you could kill the testers or they could touch it. So
you breathe,
yes.
you breathe in the drug.
So it has to be very controlled. We had to buy special equipment, take it back to the Drug Task Force headquarters to test it, and we encourage people, the police officers, like, don't touch it, make sure we're handling it, be very, very careful, but they're not going to know, and that's some of the danger I think the EMTs face, and the first responders, when they go to some of these houses trying to save somebody's life, and they do save their lives. We've saved hundreds of lives from Narcan. Who knows what they're going to brush up against? Not only the fentanyl, but maybe there's a needle there. And that's one of the other changing things. Your original question was what's changed. It used to be heroin dealers was all needle. They are changing the form of that now, and that we've seen even some pill manufacturer that's going to be it's harder for us to keep up with. And of course, the users you used to be able to see because they had tracks on their arm.
Right.
They don't have that all the time now. So some of it still do. And again, there's all kinds of other health risks that maybe you're going to have some medical professionals. They can talk about the different diseases that come from the needles and things like that. But this is really affecting all aspects of our society, and it's all genders, it's all races, it's all ages, and it's all over the county. It's not confined to the city. I don't know whether you saw, we did that one mapping of the overdose responses.
It's all over.
It's read everywhere. Yeah, and it's people that you just wouldn't, quote, think would suffer from this. I mean, we've had medical professionals, children dying from this. It's everywhere.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, Lancaster County, your office. You have the police departments. You got state police, the Attorney General's office. Perhaps the feds are somewhere involved in there. How does that all work?
Well, I tell you what. I mean, that's one of the long-term frustrations.
That's a work in process.
It's a work in process. I mean, I'll give you an example. So we don't have a countywide police department. We have all these just 32 different departments we have to work with, and they're all great. Everybody's well-intentioned. Everyone works. My dad passed away recently, and I was going through his stuff. He was a Pirates fan. He had a Pittsburgh paper from 1971, in which they had won the World Series, right? And I'm looking at that, and right in there on section B was an article about how antiquated our police structure is in Pennsylvania, and that we don't have a countywide police force. 1971, the same quotes that DA said are still existent today. So it's frustrating for us because you lose a lot. So we need more unity. We need more collaboration between the agencies. You mentioned all those different agencies. Everybody's got an idea about prevention, education, arrest. What are we going to do? Let's consolidate our efforts. And really, I can say I'm proud. In fact, after I leave here, I'm going to go back to the office for about an hour, and then I'm heading to Harrisburg to meet with the statewide DA's Association.
Okay.
We've created a heroin task. We're trying to get everybody on the same page, is really what we're trying to do. We're meeting with the medical community, pharmacy industry. We've invited the dentists and try to talk about having one direction, because I get frustrated, just as you see ads for this rehab place, that rehab place, it's like, well, which one do I go to? We shouldn't be going in different directions with the Attorney General's office, with the DAs from the Southeast, or the DAs from the Central doing this, or DAs from any county. Same thing with police officers. We really need to coordinate and consolidate our efforts. So we're trying to do that, but I can tell you it's a challenge working with all those different agencies and different industries. We're just trying to bring them together and have something more tangible. It's great to talk about it. It's important to talk about the heroin problem. I think we've done a nice job raising awareness. What are we going to do?
Right.
What are we going to do? What's the next step?
Right. Let's talk about budgets. Okay.
Yeah.
What does this do to your budget?
Okay, so the budget hasn't really, it changes a little bit every year. We shift. I'm proud to say I've had the same number of full-time prosecutors I've had when I started 10 years ago.
Okay.
We just try to do more with less. Eventually, we're going to need to have more prosecutors. I mean, it's a growing county. The numbers are going up. We're going to have more and more problems. But I just try to make it work, and we have to be smarter. We have to make sure that we're targeting the people that these are the ones that need to go to jail, and these are the ones that need to go to jail for a long time, and here's the ones that we need to divert. So one of the things that I did was create the first ever drug diversion program in Lancaster County, which is designed to take place at the magisterial district level. You know, you got one right here, I forget which direction we're at, but right nearby. And so for your first time nonviolent offenders, somebody's cocaine or marijuana, whatever it is, they've just used once. Let's give that person a chance to fix it so they don't have a permanent criminal record. Right. And so we ask them to do a couple things, pass a couple drug tests in a short period of time. If they do that, then there's no record whatsoever, and it's not going to impact their ability to get jobs or go on to school or whatever they're going to do. Unfortunately, some of them, of course, fail, and then.
What percentage successfully complete the program, you would say?
I think it's about half that do it. A lot of them, of course, you're dealing with people that are using illegal drugs, so they're starting out
or legal
behind.
Or illegal drugs.
Yeah, they're starting out behind, and some of them, maybe they're not even using drugs. They just even go to their appointment. You got to get people to engage. But the ones that I think that are motivated, it's still, even if it's a 50% pass rate, that's 50% than before. Right. That they don't have a criminal record now. They're going to have a much better chance at life.
And they learn their lesson.
And I tell you what, I mean, honestly, if it was only 10%, I still would say it's worth it, because that's somebody that each one of these numbers, and I get frustrated when we talk about numbers in statistics, and it's important to do that in the criminal justice system. But each one of them is a person, you know, whether it's the victim, whether it's the offender, each one's a person, and we need to take them as individuals and try to do the best we can. I mean, I have no interest in putting anybody in jail. My goal would be to put myself out of a job. That means everyone's being nice to each other, and nobody's doing anything. And you know, unfortunately, that's not going to happen.
It's not the world we live in.
Yeah, it isn't. Right.
Narcan.
Yes.
Okay. Every police department carries that.
There's one department that has been reluctant to do that. Everybody else in Lancaster County does.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then EMS.
Yes.
And then are there other type of sites that
some schools have it.
Okay.
You know, I don't know about doctors' offices, but some schools are starting to do it. And actually, this is how slick the drug dealers are. Some drug dealers will actually put the Narcan with their drugs, because they could say, hey, you're not going to die from my stuff. Here, take the Narcan with it. And I don't know whether they're selling it or not, but that's how bad, you know, that's their thought process. They know they are selling stuff, poison that is going to kill somebody. Sooner or later, it's going to kill somebody. And just to take that one step further, you and I would think they actually label their brands, just like any other, you know, store, the grocery store products. They label it. So you would say, we'll have XXX heroin. People will die from certain brands that did it. And you and I would think that the addicts would say, oh my gosh, people are dying from XXX. We would stay away from that. Unfortunately, the opposite's true. When the people start dying from a certain brand, that's when that drug dealer gets busy, because the addicts want the more potent hit and they go to it. And that's, again, tying into sort of the Narcan and what your quote was about from that person about how twisted this stuff is.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody from one of the drug treatment programs, and they're talking about people who perhaps relapse.
Yeah.
So their body hasn't had the drug in their system.
Yeah.
And it's more potent to the body, and that's where also some of these overdoses happen.
You're absolutely right, and that goes back to sort of what I was saying about the 270 days, and it takes time for the body to do it. But when you've cleaned out and you've done it, you're now more vulnerable to an overdose, because that'd be like the EMT touching the fentanyl without the opioid tolerance. So you're absolutely, and we do see that. And what happens, again, the predator drug dealers play a role in this, is people will go to rehab. They know who goes to rehab. They have they're business people.
Yeah.
And when they get out, they say, hey, let's celebrate. I'll give you some heroin. And the guy's like, oh, I don't want that. But you're talking to a heroin addict. And eventually, many of them give in, and they give it. So yes, you're going to have the overdose risk. And if they do survive, you've got them hooked again.
What about people who sell drugs, and you know that who they are and that they gave drugs to somebody that died?
Yeah.
Are there stricter laws on that?
Yes.
What's that whole situation?
So that's drug delivery resulting in death, and depending on the circumstances, you could charge involuntary manslaughter. You might even be able to charge third-degree murder, depending on the circumstance, but there's a specific charge called drug delivery resulting in death that applies to that. And we, I think, have filed either 14, 15, or 16 over the past couple years. And it's not going to bring the loved one back, but I've met with some of the parents of the person that's overdosed and died. It makes a difference to them to know that there's some accountability for that person that has sold or delivered that poison that took their loved one from them.
What type of punishment does that type of case?
So typically they get a few years in state prison. That's the typical result of that. I think there's a good argument that could be made that you'd like to have a mandatory sentence for that it should be a certain floor, whether it's 3, 4, 5 years for killing somebody with this. We also have to make sure that we're using our discretion on these cases. Some of them, it's people that have used together for many, many years and they just give it to them.
Right.
I think we're going to look at that case a little bit differently than the predator drug dealer I'm talking about. Doesn't know who the person is, doesn't care. Not that it excuses any of it, but we have to find balance in punishment, and they're just these are tough sentences to find what's the right thing, particularly when it's somebody close to that person. So I've had situations where it's the actual family member has done it.
Yeah.
And very frustrating.
Is there anything that the legislature could do that you believe that would give you more tools
Yes.
to be more effective?
Absolutely. Yesterday I was in Harrisburg testifying in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee in part about this, and we'd like the mandatories restored for heroin and heroin dealers for the reasons that I stated before. A, you can interdict that drug dealer, even though maybe somebody else is going to replace them. They don't have the network. It sets them back for months. They don't have the network of distribution to do that, and it just incapacitates that person. It sends a message out there. Same thing, I'd like to see the mandatories for drug dealers with guns. So many of our violent crimes, so many of our losses have been because drug dealers are in some turf war shooting at each other. Sometimes they hit each other. Well, that's bad, but the real bad thing is when they hit an innocent person, and we've had that happen in Lancaster. And we need to make sure that drug dealers carry guns. If you're not carrying a gun as a drug dealer, you're a bad drug dealer. And so there's the violence that goes along with that. And I'd like those penalties back so that we can do that. So we can work up the chain. When they're looking at 5, 6, 7 years, now they're going to start talking to us about where the heroin came from, which can help us save lives and prosecute the bigger people up that chain. And also, quite frankly, the drug dealers know a lot about violent crime. They know about other things. So when you have that leverage of a stiff penalty against them, they'll start talking to us about old murder cases. Maybe nothing to do with drugs, but they're in that community, and they'll solve it. So that would be the thing. The best thing the legislature could do is give us the tools to fight the worst criminals, the big drug dealers. And like I said yesterday, particularly with the guns and drugs, is like right now the gun is a tool for the criminal to enforce their will and intimidate people, use violence. Make it a tool for the prosecutor. Give me a 5-year mandatory if somebody's using a gun to sell drugs, sell poisons, or if they're robbing something. Make it a tool for us again. That would be the one thing. I think the other thing is, ultimately, as anything, so many other issues, it's going to come back to resources. And I think we need to, as a state, shift our thought process and the resources into the long-term rehab rather than the short-term. We're just giving them a gold star and wishing them well. It's well-intended. It's people believe in their jobs, they do a great job. They can't fight the science of 270 days. And we really need to put the resources in those long-term rehabs.
Your office has a tip line?
Yes.
And what's that?
You can go online. I forget what the actual number is. I'm sorry. I didn't bring it, but it's right on our website, and we have the drug task force as well. It's just going to go right on the website, and you can do it. We have anonymous things that you can do as well. We want the information. Ultimately, our first priority, as anybody in government should be, is to save lives, and then we'll sort out the rest later. But we will always work with people. There's a lot of people that are conflicted, their family members and stuff. But those family members, if they're struggling with addiction, they're not going to get better on their own. Almost no one can do it on their own. They need to, the family has to be engaged and has to help us out. And unfortunately, sometimes they need to go to jail, at least for a little bit, to get them just clean and save them. But we're not going to rest our way out of the problem.
We've got to leave it there. We've
sorry.
been talking to District Attorney of Lancaster County, Craig Stedman. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you, sir.
Think it over.
Yep.